Je passe la parole à Jean-Michel Frodon, qui était dans la conception de ce projet du Collège de France. On va commencer avec Ashish, qui va nous parler de cinéma indien, Wale, Richard Peña, mais je ne vais pas bouffer ton temps, me dire Jean-Michel. À toi.
Merci Amos, bonjour à vous tous d'être là, merci de votre présence. Pour la dernière partie, la dernière demi-journée de ces 2 jours au Collège de France, nous avons souhaité avec Amos inscrire cet ensemble de réflexions autour du cinéma et en particulier des enjeux d'archives et d'histoire qui ont été traversés et éclairés de tant de façons enrichissantes depuis hier matin, de l'inscrire dans des éclairages concernant des grandes cinématographies mondiales et plus particulièrement des grands cinéastes ou des grands auteurs dans un certain nombre de cas, au milieu de quoi j'aurai la tâche un peu compliquée de réintroduire le cinéma d'Amos comme faisant évidemment partie de ces problématiques et étant à la fois enrichi et inscrit dans le contexte que vont partager avec nous des très bons connaisseurs de ces différents domaines. Je les présenterai au fur et à mesure qu'ils prendront la parole. Les 2 premières interventions, comme j'espère vous en avez été prévenus, seront en anglais. Et les personnes qui ont des difficultés avec cette langue peuvent se procurer un casque pour la traduction. My dear colleagues, we are pretty late, so I have to ask you to be pretty strict on the duration of any of your speech, because we are already way behind schedule, but hopefully we're not going to get worse. Nous allons donc commencer immédiatement avec Ashish Rajadhyaksha, qui est un historien du cinéma, qui est professeur, qui est organisateur de festivals et d'expositions, qui est l'auteur de nombreux ouvrages sur le cinéma indien, qui est basé à Bangalore, mais qui a aussi intervenu à Séoul, à Hong Kong, à New York et dans beaucoup de parties du monde. On lui doit un ensemble d'ouvrages concernant le cinéma indien tout à fait important, dont l'un, Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema, qu'il a coécrit avec Paul Willemen. Paul Willemen qui est lié à l'histoire d'Amos, puisqu'il fait partie des grands critiques et penseurs du cinéma qui ont été parmi les tout premiers à identifier l'importance du cinéma d'Amos Gitaï dès House, le film dont on a déjà bien parlé ce matin, auquel il avait consacré un travail, une réflexion tout à fait riche d'anticipation sur l'importance de ce qui était en train de naître sous le nom du cinéaste Amos Gitaï au début des années 80. Et donc c'est aussi, je crois, une des bonnes raisons d'Ashish parmi nous, qui va parler en particulier d'une immense figure du cinéma indien, mais du cinéma mondial, qui est Ritvik Ghatak. Ashish.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, and thank you to everybody. I believe I'm the reason for a major technological intervention this afternoon, with various devices. So anyway, here I am. Jean-Michel, I'll take 30 minutes, right? That's my schedule. And I have a 9-minute clip to show, so I'll try and end my presentation inside
Do what must be done. We trust you.
Yes, inside of 20 minutes. So that's the plan. There's a little bit of autobiography involved here, involving Amos Gitaï and our first meetings. We first met, in fact, in Paris, when Amos showed me this film that he had made at that time called Ananas. I didn't know very much about his cinema at the time, and the only thing that of interest was that my native language of Marathi describes pineapple as ananas. That is the name of the word pineapple in my language of Marathi. So that is what got me started. But there was something else that got me really interested, and that was that a person whom I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about, a mutual friend, Paul Willeman, probably familiar to many of you here, he had become something of a key figure in my life, and he was the person who told me to meet Amos Gitaï and to see Pineapple, because it seemed to Willeman at the time that that particular film was causing a major development in a theory that Willeman was building in those days. This was 1984, when Pineapple, I think, had just been made. But that was an important year because the third Cinema conference had taken place in Edinburgh. And Paul Willeman had co-organized that conference with Jim Pines. And in fact, I spoke on Ritvik Ghatak at that time as well. Willeman, in those days, was thinking about the third Cinema and thinking about how a filmmaker like Gitaï and a film like Pineapple would so significantly develop a theory that even until then was primarily connected with Latin America. Mostly the third Cinema was seen to be Latin American film. By expanding that concept to include cinemas of resistance and protest inside Europe, even more particularly inside Britain, talking to various kinds of formations that were developing globally. This was some kind of a project that he was interested in developing. And I'm going to say a little bit about that because it does seem, as we expand this entire panel to include Latin American film, Black African film, and other such traditions, to speak of a particular, this is interesting, I think, methodology that Willeman had defined at that point of time on how what he subsequently would call comparative film studies would develop. I mean, what comparative film studies had come to mean. Until then, and perhaps even since then, our familiarity with each other's cultures exists, I guess, primarily through a kind of area studies model where we become experts in some language, civilization, or culture other than our own, or through some idea of cultural exchange. You know, your culture, my culture. My culture is a sealed culture. I come here representing my civilization, so to say, and you represent yours. And when you and I talk, it is as though our civilizations are in conversation, something like that. And there would be certain sorts of, you might say, national exchange programs which facilitate that kind of cultural exchange, which Willeman was profoundly against. He developed a major critique of that, and from that context also a critique of film festivals and other such occasions that allow for that kind of cultural exchange. Instead of that, he presented what seems to me to be a methodology by which comparative cultural projects can be developed by assembling together filmmakers who did not have any either obviously political or formal connection with each other. Very difficult to look at them as linked to each other. And later on in my presentation, I will speak of the startling consequences of Willeman putting Gitaï's cinema along with that of Ritvik Ghatak. Not a filmmaker that you would think of firsthand as having any resemblance to Willeman. In order to make that kind of set of clusters take place across civilizations, across cultural practices, Willeman developed at that time what he described as sort of cinematic family resemblances. This is his phrase, family resemblances that occur at important level. He speaks of other ways of existing, why film narratives exist, other ways of existing and negotiating of processes of historical/geographical transformation. Such transformation he defines in a very particular manner, and I think this is of interest when you start looking at the films he's talking about. Pineapple at that time being the most important, but subsequently in probably one of the maybe even now, I don't know, one of the best-known essays, at least in the English-speaking world, on Gitaï's cinema is Willeman's essay on the editing of Berlin, Jerusalem, and Bangkok, Bahrain. It's a particular argument that he makes, and I'll come to that argument in just a minute. Willeman speaks of him as a project that focuses on commonalities as well as differences within a shared encounter within the transformative dynamics generated by the processes of capital accumulation. Now, he then makes a link between the processes of capital accumulation on the one hand and narrative processes on the other. This is what gets him started in terms of family resemblance. And you can see now why Pineapple became such an important film for that kind of thinking. Such a shared encounter, he says, perhaps produces the only really positive consequence of globalization. What cultural critics have to say about their frame can now become directly relevant to other people working in other geopolitical frames. He wants now to ask, he says, he doesn't want to ask the question of cinema historically, but he wants to ask, and I think this happened this morning in the way that history was spoken about in relation to Gitai's work, he wants to ask the question of history cinematically. So in what way would be a cinematic understanding of history rather than a historical understanding of cinema would be the way he wants to take this forward. And in the process of doing that, he puts together a set of practices which may resemble translation, the way that, a cinema translates into another cinema, or a way of understanding it translates into other forms of intelligibility, but actually relates much more to various forms of cross-cultural exchange related to economic practices, capitalist practices. A kind of a demystifying mechanism by which the cinema could actually define itself in relation to, again I quote him, an immanent viewer location. So there is a particular way by which a particular sort of cinema invents a particular viewer, and it is the way that it engages with that makes it available for being understood outside of that immediate exchange. It's a slightly complicated idea, I think, even now for film studies to comprehend. But there are these kind of now methodologies that he will provide by which this can happen. 3 of them. I'll just read this just a paragraph which I'll read. It's a little too complicated for me to work with spontaneously. 3 attributes. One is what he calls inner speech. It's a phrase that he uses, inner speech. The second is the phrase cinephilia, which is probably more familiar to us. And the third is a concept that he will now call the fourth look. Williman explores how the cinema can dramatize the very process of modernization, as the differential encounters with capitalism. 3 of the cinema's most important properties have been, he suggests, the capacity to address inner speech, which is actually a kind of an interior universe of a film. It's something that's inside the film, something that it is trying to say, but which is not necessarily available if you reduce a film to only its surface meaning of plot, what it is ostensibly saying, because actually the film is saying a great deal more. It is saying something far more complicated than what it apparently allows you to understand. When you go in there, you figure out the inner speech, you can make some other sense of it. The second, the cinephilia, and the third, the fourth look, all 3 concepts, he says, are innate to the cinema. They are basic to cinema, that is to say to all celluloid film, where filmmakers who are conscious of this fact, whether they're conscious of this fact or not, actually work whenever they are taking a shot within a fiercely fought sort of tension that exists over every frame of every film that has ever been made. Now this is a drastic proposition. It says like practically any film actually reveals that tension almost autonomously of the filmmaker's intentions once you get into what that film is really doing, the work that the particular film is doing. All of these formulations, inner speech, cinephilia, and the fourth look, demonstrate a tussle of some sort, a relentless war of attrition going on whenever a shot is taken in a celluloid film. Now, this is him speaking. That whenever a shot is taken, when a filmmaker says, start camera, to the point where he says, cut, some kind of a tension now exists in the entire process of taking that particular shot. Contrary to what they might appear to be doing, filmed images, in fact, typically offer a clear disjuncture between an outer mechanical frame and a more engaged inner frame, a kind of an interior frame, a frame of attention, which works like an essential subset of a larger, elusive picture, the normative demarcation of the viewer's gaze. So if you like, there is a kind of a big picture, and there is a viewer who's, an imagined viewer who's looking at the big picture, let us say an Israeli viewer of a Gitaï film. You have something else inside it, some sort of it's like a film within a film, which creates a viewer within a viewer, which allows you to make another kind of capacity of meaning, which can, he says, travel across cultures. Now, this is the broad, as quickly as I could put together a life's body of work into 10 minutes, this is broadly the kind of armature with which he would speak. He would now start making connections between the Indian filmmaker Ritvik Ghatak, the Brazilian filmmaker Nelson Pereira dos Santos, or Glauber Rocha. He would start talking about Hu Shaoxian. He would start talking about, Wong Kar-wai, and other such filmmakers, and put them together in various and interesting combinations, which completely defeat any kind of cultural purpose, any kind of sense of where these filmmakers might come from. And he would say that it's because they're filmmakers that you're allowed to do this. And I'm not terribly sure that comparative film studies, in this sense, has actually been picked up, whether we are still sort of a little bit stuck within an earlier cultural exchange paradigm. And it is from here that he will now move to Gitaï. Yeah? Amos Gitaï's films, says Paul Willeman, show that it is most decidedly not through the point of view shots that we spectators are mobilized, but through the differences between, for example, one point of view and another, even within a shot. And I think you would have seen this in the clips that we saw, especially yesterday, of how actually points of view will change within single shots. This dialogue with the viewer, he says, is to be traced in this pattern of differences. And I think yesterday we spoke a little bit, or you spoke a little bit about juxtaposition. And juxtapositions then will become quite an interesting thing here, an interesting phenomenon here. In the shifts between markers, such as a point of view manifested in the body of the text. So a text has a point of view, that point of view has a body, that body in turn has a particular sort of a shot-making structure, and then there is that internal struggle. This is where we learn who the filmmaker thinks he or she is talking to, or what he or she thinks we know or are interested in. So this is not editing in the sense of montage, and in fact it's of interest, and we have Mr. Eisenstein himself here today, that Willeman actually had problems with Eisenstein's theory of montage. He actually considered it, especially as he received it, misleading and maybe even problematic. He wanted to think of another form of, let's say, symbolic clashes that take place rather than more conventionally understood editing sort of apparatuses. And this is what I think will show a filmmaker like Ghatak as having any resemblance to Willeman. Of considerable interest here, however, is the next step, which is the way that he suddenly ups the ante to make all of these debates not arcane debates within filmmaking and so on, but actually political debates that in fact define complex phenomena such as national formations. I mean, he will do that. I mean, he will make that link. He says the relevance of the film, Gitaï's film, to the current political issues cannot be underestimated. It is the most explicit cinematic statement to date, he's talking about Berlin, Jerusalem, of a position which receives all too little exposure in cinema by showing the ideological as well as the experiential that were and are active in the formation of the Israeli state. This is Willeman speaking. And so the jump is quite startling. Gitaï points to the possibility and indeed necessity of a different state formation adjusting to a more realistically to the actual needs and conditions prevalent in the area. The film is a contribution to the growing debate about what the options in fact are. And so I've called my presentation Options in that particular sense. Now comes the final point I wanted to make, which was what got me implicated in this. This presentation now makes Willeman speak of two Indian filmmakers who, says Willeman, do the same thing as what Gitaï is doing. One of them is the filmmaker Ritvik Ghatak, and the other is the filmmaker Kumar Shahani. Now, neither Ghatak nor Shahani have heard of Willeman, heard of Gitaï, nor would Gitaï at that time probably have heard of either of these filmmakers in the early 1980s, and yet there is that extraordinary connection that takes place. And I want to now use this not so much to understand Gitaï, but to try and use, let's say, a Gitaï theory of cinema that Williman explores to understand a filmmaker that comes from where I come from, which is India. For me to try and understand an Indian filmmaker using this detour is actually what I'm trying to do here. And so on to Ritvik Ghatak, the filmmaker whom I'm going to be speaking about a little bit. Ghatak, interestingly, is actually also from an extremely troubled state structure. He is from what would come to then be Bangladesh, but it wasn't Bangladesh at the time when he was born, and he had moved to Calcutta back in the 1940s. And in the late 1940s, of course, we have partition, and India and Bangladesh, at that time East Pakistan, become two separate countries. Yeah? This particular problem that occurs when countries split up into two zones leads to consequences which apparently may have made Williman think of Ghatak when speaking of Gitaï, which is actually the manner in which these kinds of fissured spaces, these spaces of division that take place, actually translate into subjective conditions, where individuals act out this kind of split that takes place, which is supposedly a political split, but may in fact have a consequence that's far from conventionally political. And so I want to now show you something like seven or 8 minutes, I think 8 minutes of a very, very famous sequence from a film called Komal Gandhar, made in 1961. Komal Gandhar is a note on the Indian musical scale. It has been, I think, poorly translated as E-flat, which is precisely misleading, rather. So what's happened here is this, that this is set in the Calcutta of its time, and it's to do with radical theatre groups. And in fact, we have had in India, in 1943, the famine occurred. This was during the war. And the famine led to 5 million people dying of hunger, one of the most important political instances in the subcontinent at that point of time, because it occurred not because there was shortage of food, but because of war profiteering. And you had a situation after that that led to radical theater practices emerging, and Ghatak then would come, he would join the Communist Party and would become part of the Indian People's Theatre Association, which is the referent of the radical theater movement there. Inside the film, what happens is that there are two theater groups who are in some ways rivals of each other, partly because although they are radical and although they have no supposedly support for the partition of India, one happens to come from formerly Bangladesh and the other happens to come from what is India. So there is a peculiar form of ethnic division that takes place, which leads to internal rivalries and tensions and these fissures that occur. You have a situation where the heroine who's part of one theater group and the hero who's part of another have a peculiar kind of an attraction, but then they have to work it all out within the context of this kind of larger history. In the sequence that I'm going to show you, what happens is that I'll just say a little bit about this. Can you have the... So what happens in the film is that the theater groups get together and they go to a place called Lal Gola. It's important because that place happens to be right near the Padma River, and the Padma River is the river that is more or less the river that divides India and Bangladesh. So, you can actually see the national border that takes place. This is actually an extremely, it's now completely, there are these barricades that exist on this particular national border. But what happens is this theater group arrives there, and then they are in their radical, so to say, moment, and they're singing a lot of songs that are extremely famous in the theater groups of the time, and you will now see what happens.
কি একটা পাখি খালি ডাকছে এই কলকাতার
Sorry, my subtitles, my subtitles have gone off frame. So I don't know why that is. One second, let me try and do this. I'll just increase it like this so that I won't show you the full frame. Yeah.
কাঠ তোমা তার মধ্যে পাখিটা
পাখিটাকে ছাড়ো, কাজ আরম্ভ করো।
আপনি এমন অদ্ভুত রুক্ষ না, জীবনে কোনো বন্ধু পাবেন না।
কত রকমের স্টেজ ওয়াকিং আছে আপনি জানেন? হাঁটার প্রত্যেকটা ফেজে ব্যালেন্স কোথায় থাকে, কখন কিভাবে শিফটেড হয়। আপনার হাঁটা বোন টু বোন ব্রেক করতে আপনি ধর নিন গেট আপ। এই বুড়ো আঙুল আগে মাটি ছোঁবে, তারপরে পায়ের পাতা, তারপরে গোড়ালি। এই বুড়ো আঙুল মাটি ছোঁবে, তারপরে পাতা, তারপরে গোড়ালি।
জন্মেও কেউ জুড়বে না পড়ার মুখ। বুঝলি যোগেন, আর কেউ গেল না, উনি নাচতে নাচতে বাড়ি গিয়ে হাজির। পাঠ শেখার কি উৎসাহ!
তোমরা এইভাবে নেবে জানলে আমি কখনোই বলতাম না। আগে পালা
আসছে।
দেখো ওই লালগোলা থেকে সেই 1 বিঘা ফলটা এসে গেছে। কালকে রাত্রে তুমি টাকা দিয়েছি, ভোরবেলা এসে বাসে নিয়ে যাবে। এদিকে জয়ার বাড়িতে গিয়ে দেখি সেই পুরোনো অ্যাফেয়ার। খুব মেরেছে, প্রচন্ড আটকে রেখে দিয়েছে।
জয়াকে মেরেছে মানে?
ওই আর কি, বনেদি অর্থোডক্স বাড়ি থিয়েটারে ঘোর আপত্তি। জয়াও তেমনি লুকিয়ে পালিয়ে ঝগড়া করে চলে আসে, আর এখানে এসে হাসি দিয়ে ঢাকবার চেষ্টা করে।
কিন্তু এখন এই লালগোলা যাবার ক্রাইসিসে আমি কি করি?
আচ্ছা, রোলটা কি খুব বড়?
আরে না না, আমি তো তাই বলতে যাচ্ছিলাম, মানে আপনি তুলে ফেলুন। এই সাংবাদিক রিহার্সাল তাকে অফ করুন। আর সেনা, তুমি অনুসূয়াকে নিয়ে আমাদের রিহার্সাল করে চলে যাও, তৈরি করো। চলো। আর ইন্ডিভিজুয়াল রোল যা যা তৈরি করবার আছে গেলে
দিগু শোনো, আমাদের কার্শিয়ানে একটা বাড়ি আছে, খালি পড়ে থাকে সেটা। আমি ওকে বলে সেখানে কদিন থাকার ব্যবস্থা করতে পারি। বাইরে গিয়ে রিহার্সাল দিলে রিহার্সাল বেশ জোর হবে। আর আমাদের সবাই বেশ একটা আলোচনা হবে। কি বলে, ব্যবস্থা করি?
করতে পারেন। আপনাদের রিহার্সাল তো বেশ শৌখিন ভাবে হয়।
এসো মুক্ত করো ওই অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো ওই অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা। এসো শিল্পী, এসো বিশ্বকর্মা, এসো স্রষ্টা। রসরূপ মন্ত্র দ্রষ্টা। ছিন্ন করো বান্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। ছিন্ন করো বান্ধনের এই অন্ধকার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার। এসো মুক্ত করো অন্ধকারের এই দ্বার।
তারপরে যে ঘরটা সেটা শান্তাদের সঙ্গে ওরকম ল্যাং ল্যাং করে ঘুরে বেড়াস কেন? ওরা চপ কাটলেট খাওয়ায়। ঘুরবি না, ওরা বদ। আচ্ছা, খাবো না। না, ওকে।
আসুন আসুন, দেখবেন, আসুন না।
কোথায় যাচ্ছেন? ওই পদ্মার মাঝে জাগনার চরে যন্ত্র আনছেন নাকি?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, এই যে নিচ্ছি।
দেখি দেন।
একবার ঘুরতাইয়া গেছি, আবার আসি। একবার ঘুরতাইয়া গেছি, আবার এসেছি। হেইও রে হেইও বলো ভাই। আরে ফুটা নৌকায় ভাই খেলে না, বাড়ি চলে যায়। আরে হেইও রে হেইও বলো ভাই। আরে ফুটা নৌকায় বাস খেলে না, বাড়ি চলে যায়। আরে মটকট গুলের মুখ খিচালি সঙ্গে পেজালা। এর লাগুলো ধৈর্য পাক দেখুনের লঙ্কাতে মাখা। খেলে না, বাড়ি
পদ্মামাকে কাছে পেয়ে মাথায় ঠেকাচ্ছেন?
এপার পদ্মা ওপার পদ্মা, মধ্যিখানে জাগনার চর, আমরা বসে আছি। নেন, ধরেন ধরেন।
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা।
এপার পদ্মা ওপার পদ্মা রে, মাঝে দাগ নারে সোর, তারি পরে বৈশায় আছেন শিব সদাগর, তারি পরে বৈশায় আছেন শিব সদাগর। এপার পদ্মা ওপার পদ্মা রে,
আপনি জানেন ওপারে না পূর্ব বাংলা, এটা পদ্মা। আমি আগে জানতাম না। ওপারেই কোথাও আমার দেশের বাড়ি। এখানকার আকাশটা ধোঁয়া না। আজ এমন মন খারাপ হয়ে গেল। কথাটা বোধহয় নিশ্চিন্তি। আমার ঠাকুমা বলতেন সেই নিশ্চিন্তি বোধহয় আর আমরা ফিরে পাবো না। মনে হয় আমরা যেন কেমন বাইরের লোক হয়ে গেছি। আপনার মনে হয় না? দেশের কথা ভাবলেই মনে পড়ে সেই জল আর সাঁকো। সকালবেলা মা চান করিয়ে সূর্যপুত্র করাতে নিয়ে যেতেন। সেকালে কত হাঁটতাম। চলুন হাঁটবেন?
চলো। ওই পারি আমার দেশের বাড়ি। ওই যে ঘরগুলো দেখা যাচ্ছে এত কাছে, অথচ কোনোদিন আমি ওখানে পৌঁছতে পারবো না। ওটা বিদেশ। যখন তুমি বললে ও বাড়ি কোথাও তোমার দেশের বাড়ি, তখন আমি কি করছিলাম জানো? নিজের বাড়িটা খুঁজে বার করবার চেষ্টা করছিলাম। কারণ কোথাও নয়, ঠিক ওই বাড়ি আমার দেশের বাড়ি। যে রেল লাইনটার উপরে আমরা দাঁড়িয়েছিলাম কলকাতা থেকে ফেরার সময়, ঠিক ওইখানে ট্রেন থেকে নামতাম। স্টিমার থাকতো দাঁড়িয়ে, ওপারে নিয়ে যেত। মা অপেক্ষা করে থাকতেন। ওখানে দাঁড়িয়ে একটা মজার কথা মনে এলো। মনে হলো ওই রেল লাইনটা তখন ছিল একটা যোগ চিহ্ন, আর এখন কেমন যেন বিয়োগ চিহ্ন হয়ে গেছে। ওখানে দেশটা কেটে দু টুকরো হয়ে গেছে।
সত্যি আমাদের বাংলাদেশটা যে কি হয়ে গেল।
তুমি সেদিন বললে আমি অকারণ রুক্ষ, আমি কোনো বন্ধু পাবো না, ঠিক। কিন্তু জানো, আমি সব সময় এমন ছিলাম না। এমন একদিন ছিল যেদিন পদ্মার ওপারে বসে অল্প অল্প 7 ঘন্টার শব্দ ভেসে আসতো, আকাশের মেঘগুলো মুহূর্তে মুহূর্তে রং বদলাতো। কিন্তু তারপর এক মুহূর্তে সর্বশান্ত হয়ে গেলাম আমরা। বাবা মারা গেলেন ফিকিরির মতো। মা একরকম না খেতে পেয়ে শেষ হয়ে গেলেন চোখের সামনে। মরার ঠিক আগেই বাবা বলেছিলেন, জীবনটাকে আরম্ভ করেছিলাম কি নির্মল ছন্দে, এইভাবে শেষ হয়ে যাওয়াটা কি উচিত? সেদিন থেকে আমি কেমন যেন হয়ে গেলাম, কি ভীষণ একা হয়ে গেছি, তুমি জানো না।
ভৃগু, আমিও বড় একা, কি ক্লান্ত।
কি হলো? অনুসয়া
ক্লান্ত। ও কিছু না, তুমি কিছু মনে করো না। যা, কি হয়ে গেল একটা।